Hello, RGL3000 students. Dr. Conway here to talk about Lesson 7, Typical Steps in RIAS and SEA. This particular topic is relevant because we've been going through the different types of socioeconomic analysis for regulatory impact studies. And we talked about the role of sustainable development. We talked about how sustainable development encourages us to integrate economic, social, cultural, and environmental factors, and how in some jurisdictions, like in the EU, they're integrating these elements within their regulatory impact studies, whereas in North America and Canada and the United States, we've tended to keep them relatively separate. RIAS is focusing primarily on efficiency and effectiveness or cost-related impacts of regulation, whereas we use other policy instruments to focus on other aspects, whether those be sociological impact studies, cultural impact studies, or environmental impact studies. So today I want to talk to you about the RIAS, and I want to talk to you about SEA as one of the accompanying requirements that we undertake when we ever think a regulation is going to have a significant environmental impact. Okay, we do an SEA. All right, but there are other techniques that we use for determining the impacts of regulations in the area of social, cultural, and environmental, which we've been touching on in the other parts of the course. But today we're going to focus on the RIAS and the SEA. The RIAS portion of this lesson also links to what you did in Part 1. In Part 1, I asked you to identify a regulation, identify the harm, identify the objectives, identify regulation as being the best option to address it or not. But in the second half of your research project, you're going to be looking at the cost-benefit aspects of this regulation that you've adopted in Part 1, which means that if you didn't do a comprehensive job of defining your regulation and so on in Part 1, you'll need to revisit that and can recoup some of the grades if you scored, say, lower than 24 out of 30 or whatever the case may be, as I said in my previous discussions. But so today I want to just recap the RIAS and I want to talk about SEA. But in the context of talking about SEA, I'll also mention a few other various techniques we use to look at the environmental impacts of regulation. Okay, so let's get started on this now, and we'll go from there. Hang on, here we go. Yeah, all right. So we know that all federal regulations, just to recap after our week off, must undergo a regulatory impact assessment prior to their adoption as required by the Cabinet Directive on Streamlining Regulation. Now, the way this would typically work is that a RIAS statement would be produced that would be posted with notification in Gazette 1, notification that the government is proposing to proceed with a regulation. We would see accompanying that would be a RIAS statement. Now, it's important to understand that that statement would be on the basis of the number of studies that the government would have conducted, or a number of experiences the government would have accumulated through its other activities, indicating that the regulation is needed and the harm. So the RIAS statement simply summarizes all of that knowledge. If it's in a really complex regulatory change, the government would potentially have conducted numerous background studies before proceeding, okay, with that regulation. And basically the RIAS summarizes that. The RIAS statement summarizes that, those findings within the categories laid out in the RIAS Writer's Guide. What I'm asking you to do is perform both the background study and the RIAS, which becomes your executive summary for your background study, both following, in your case, those sections laid out in the RIAS Writer's Guide. All right? So, and each of these RIASs is written according to those government guidelines. So you're basically learning that process, okay? It's important to remember, though, that a RIAS assesses the anticipated effectiveness and efficiency impacts of a new regulation on the regulated community, regulating community within government, and third parties, all right? And Don't forget your framework and cost benefits, direct, indirect, intended, and unintended, as a way of conceptualizing. All right, that doesn't have to be laid out that way in your RIAS, but of conceptualizing impacts on effectiveness and efficiency. Okay? The RIAS essentially asks 3 core questions that you have to reacquaint yourself with. Right? Is the regulation designed in a manner that will be as effective as possible, given current knowledge and capacity, for achieving the main objectives of the government for which the policy instrument is intended, which in our case, of course, is harm reduction, as you've learned, right? You've also learned that hazard times exposure equals risk, okay? What we're trying to do is we're trying to regulate for controlling the level of risk. How do we do that? We either control the nature of the hazard, or we control the nature of the exposure that poses the greatest amount of risk that needs to be controlled in order to capture the benefits of the product. Is the regulatory approach the most cost efficient for achieving the government's main objectives as compared to the manner in which the government currently addresses similar subject matter? We're always in life comparing to a baseline, right? So in this case, the baseline is similar subject matter and how we've been addressing it. Are we proposing a regulatory approach that will be at least as effective and efficient as we have typically addressed these kind of problems in the past? Are changes to our regulation justified to improve prospects for achieving the government's objectives in an effective and cost-efficient manner? Okay, and so that question may be when you're doing an amendment to a regulation or an adjustment to a regulation. And we have already learned that the scope of a RIAS is determined by the scope of the proposed new policy instrument. What are we proposing to address? Therefore, within that scope, we need to look at the impacts, effectiveness and efficiency, cost, benefits, direct, indirect, intended, and unintended. Do the benefits of regulatory action exceed the costs as far as we can reasonably tell? And this means that we're asking certain sub-questions of those 3 communities, right? Industry. What new fees, and this is the kind of data that you're going to have to collect to, or suppose in our case, to be able to complete the cost-benefit analysis for your RIAS. Why are we doing a cost-benefit analysis? You've already learned that for medium and high impact, or for those regulations determined through triage, that they are medium to high impact, requirement of government is that a cost-benefit be conducted for those types of regulations. So we have to ask certain questions to be able to complete that cost-benefit analysis and gather the appropriate data. One of those is the impacts that we'll have on the regulated parties. So in this case, let's say industry. What new fees and charges would the regulated community need to pay, and are they sustainable? What new and additional compliance costs can be expected of the industry, and how will we factor those in? All right. Are the techniques, technologies, or processes readily available in the marketplace at manageable costs? In other words, you cannot regulate something if it's not going to be possible for the industry to comply, because the technology to comply simply does not exist. We've had this discussion before about the issue of Roundup, as you recall, right? Everybody knows that Roundup now is being discovered for certain kinds of risks. The government is not moving hastily to ban Roundup, because what is it going to be replaced with? Okay. And this is why at the same time that Bayer can be stalling action on Roundup, they're spending billions to develop alternatives to Roundup. This is all has a rationale behind it, the way this is all unfolding. All right. So, and that all relates to the fact that now that Roundup has been on the market, it's the largest used, the highest used herbicide in the market. It's not something the government can simply just ban without a viable replacement, right? That wouldn't be sustainable. So we're encouraging movement towards replacements before the product will ultimately be phased out of the market. And will the regulations as we're designing them unnecessarily disadvantage the competitiveness of any segment of the regulated community? Often we need to look at the fact that the big guys, the big industries, are already probably in compliance with anything we're going to want to regulate. But the small and medium-sized manufacturers may not be. And we've discussed this before. Often governments will accompany regulations with other measures to help with high levels of compliance, whether that be technology cooperation, capital depreciation allowances on the tax system, any types of measures that may be needed to make sure that any regulation we develop is not simply helping the big guys by wiping out the little guys, right, and creating a monopolistic environment, right, or an oligopolistic environment in the marketplace. Okay. What are likely to be effects on employment within the sector? Okay, if there's a significant impact expected in any of these things, you need to be able to account for that and adjust for it, or the cabinet committee is probably not going to approve your regulation. Okay, they're going to be looking for whoa, okay, I realize the harm is serious, but wow, look at the potential negative impacts on the economy we might be having here. So governments, by their very nature, are going to want to regulate a harm, as we've all learned, but they're going to want to regulate a harm with creating minimal additional harm as absolutely possible. All right. So, for example, when we moved on regulating the economy for controlling COVID-19 and its spread, the government just didn't say everybody stay home, have a nice day until the bug is no longer a threat. Obviously, not viable, right? So the government instead spent $200 and some odd billion supporting people during the emergency regulations on controlling the spread of COVID-19. That's a good example of what will happen in a much smaller scale in a lot of regulatory situations. All right. So these are the types of things that a RIAS needs to think about. All right. Because remember, the RIAS is a public consultation document that will post at the Gazette, but it's also the document when it's finally revised based on public comments and it goes up to cabinet for approval. The regulation goes up, the regulatory review document goes up, all of these documents go up. The RIAS is going to still be a key document for which the cabinet will make its decision. They'll look at it and they'll kind of say, yeah, okay, the harm is worthwhile controlling. Yes, we agree that regulation is the best way to do it, but I'm not happy with the way this costs, and then boom, it's stalled. It gets sent back to the department and everything starts all over again, which can take a year, 2 years. All right. So when you send something up to cabinet for approval, you're going to want to know that you've considered the cost-benefit impacts, and that if there are major negative impacts, that there are additional policy measures that accompany the regulation to make it more palatable for the economy and therefore make it more palatable for politicians to sign off on it. Okay. Now, respect to the public. Regulatory requirements typically require companies to invest in better techniques, technologies, or processes. And these costs are in turn passed on to the market through price changes where possible. They can be also passed on to the workforce through cutbacks or whatever, all right? So what are these price effects likely to be? Can effects on the employment picture in the regulated community be anticipated? And these are also factors that our RIAS needs to take into consideration. Now, I recognize when you're doing your RIASs, we don't have the resources or the capacity or the time to do extensive econometric studies in this area, but you need to anticipate some of these things. Either there's going to be significant employment impacts or there isn't going to be. Okay, and how are we going to account for those? But we'll talk about that more as we go on. Now, for government, there's impacts as well, right? When a government adopts a new regulation, remember that conversation on scarcity and opportunity costs we had from the perspective of the regulator. But once you adopt a new regulation, you need to be able to account for that. You need to be able to have compliance, promotion, and enforcement within government for that regulation, or it means nothing. We discussed that too, right? You can have some countries with lots of beautiful regulations on the books, but those regulations really mean nothing because the compliance, promotion, and enforcement budget is not there in the government department or departments responsible for implementing that regulation. So, one of the things that my firm used to do is actually help departments deal with planning for the regulatory implementation. Okay. Are there going to be not only additional costs, but are there going to be additional revenue sources for the government department based on the regulation? Are there going to be, for example, additional fees and charges to be imposed by the government? In other words, is there going to be a cost recovery mechanism in the regulation? cost-effective changes internal to government, including identifying new products and services. What's going to have to happen to, try to achieve high compliance rates here, or to advance enforcement? Are there going to be any changes to core functions, or are new resources going to be needed to be added to core functions, and so on? Okay. So we typically would develop a resource model for looking at that, look at future requirements. Don't forget the difference between fixed and variable costs. We've had that discussion before, and so on. We won't go into it a lot here. So keep those things in mind. I mean, we're going to be dealing with this stuff largely for the rest of the course, okay? And thinking about, with respect to our RIASs at least, thinking about these things. So make use of the Zoom calls for asking any questions you have about how to set these things up. Okay. Now, how does strategic environmental assessment fit into this? This is something that also has to accompany a RIAS if we anticipate that any regulatory change is going to have, or could potentially have, a significant environmental impact. The Government of Canada, by Cabinet Directive, requires that a strategic environmental assessment be completed. All right. And the strategic environmental assessment considers the potential type and magnitude of negative or positive environmental effects that could occur as direct or indirect results of a policy or program change, including a regulation. All right. It suggests ways to mitigate negative effects and maximize positive effects on the environment of a regulatory change. For example, let's say that the Government of Canada was suddenly going to adopt a regulation that allowed a new port to be built on Lake Superior, the biggest Great Lake in the north. Okay. But in order to be able to do that, there needed to be a new regulation or an amendment to an existing regulation. This would clearly be a case where not only would a RIAS be required, because this would be a major regulatory change, but an SEA would also be required because you're dealing with the Great Lakes. So obviously, any policy change in this area could have a significant environmental impact. So when a regulation went up to approval by Cabinet, it would need to be accompanied, in addition to all the other documents we've discussed, it would also need to have an SEA attached. Okay. And the SEA has become a kind of common occurrence throughout, most OECD countries, following basically the Brundtland Commission in Agenda 21 that recommended that there be a anticipatory type of an analytical framework for looking at major policy program changes that could have a down-road impact on the environment. All right. So in Canada, we adopted that as a Cabinet Directive on SEA. Okay. Now these slides you can review these slides. I don't need to go into in great detail, but the Cabinet Directive is basically the Cabinet Directive on Environmental Assessment of Policy Plan and Program Proposals, which you should all be reading. And to consider environmental concerns at the strategic policy, plan, and program development level, including significant regulatory changes. All right. An SEA must be performed if the following conditions are met. A proposal is submitted to the Minister for approval, which, when you're dealing with a regulatory change, is virtually always. Okay. The thresholds requiring an SEA depend on the department or agency, but generally proposals over $5 million in anticipated expenditure or adoption of a new policy framework generally will be required to have an SEA if that change is anticipated to have potential for down-road impacts on the environment. Implementation of the proposal may result in important environmental effects, either positive or negative. So in those cases, criteria 1 is met. The proposal has to go to the minister, and it's going to have a significant impact that it exceeds $5 million, which is almost anything of a significant regulatory nature that government would do these days. $5 million doesn't take you very far, right? $5 million is, it's a drop in the bucket these days, right? So any major regulatory change that could have a significant positive or negative effects on the environment, when you send that regulation up for approval to Cabinet, is going to require an SEA. All right. So obviously regulators need to be aware of that. And the way we determine whether significant impacts will occur is very much like what we do with a triage for RIAS, right? So a triage, we say, okay, this regulation is going to be a medium level or high impact regulation, therefore a full RIAS will have to be completed and a cost benefit analysis will have to be completed. All right. Same thing principle applies with SEA. We do an initial triage scan and say, is it likely that this regulatory change could have an impact on the environment down the road? So obviously, if you were going to be allowing new ports on the Great Lakes, it would have a significant down road environmental impact, not just of that project, but any policy framework change you make for allowing that hypothetical Lake Superior port will have implications for the entire Great Lakes system. So obviously this would be subject to a full SEA. All right. So these are the types of decisions that go into to complying with the SEA cabinet directive. All right. So there are special cases which you can see in the slides, but it's really important to understand that we would do a preliminary scan. The preliminary scan, one of my areas of work for a number of years with my firm was doing these types of SEA. So I would get a call from the government department saying, listen, we're going to be doing X, Y, or Z. We need an expert to look at this to determine through a triage process. We don't call it that, but we call it a preliminary scan process of whether it's likely that this could have significant down-road environmental impacts. So I would, initially I'd do a preliminary scan of that and determine yay or nay that it could have major down-road environmental impacts. And if it can have major down-road environmental impacts, I sign off on that. My recommendation, it goes to government. The government then says, well, it looks like, unless we have other experts that are saying differently, and we have to find who's right and who's wrong, as from our policy perspective, then this expert is saying that this could have significant down-road impacts. Then a full SEA would have to be completed. All right. And, there are examples where I did preliminary scans where a full SEA was not required. In other cases, it was required, all right, from my perspective. So these are the types of things that would typically go in. It's very similar to a RIAS in that perspective, right? You do the triage and you determine whether it's medium, higher impact, or you do the SEA preliminary scan, you determine whether the impact is likely to be great or not, and whether a full SEA must be completed. And the full SEA may lead to changes in the regulatory framework, all right, or the proposed regulation to make it, for example, if we were taking that port example in Lake Superior, the regulatory change might be that the regulation allowing that must be very discrete. It might have a very tight box wrapped around it, okay, saying only with respect to this particular port development will this regulation apply. Because we're not trying to, we're trying to make sure that the down-road environmental impacts are not uncontrollable at that point. That in each instance, we don't have an open door. Each instance, the approval of that development needs to be in place discreetly for that particular development, all right? So there are various ways that an SEA can have an impact, all right? So then I have slides here that talk about other features of the way to think about SEA, but you can see all of those within the cabinet directive. So make sure you do, you do look at that cabinet directive. And then I talk about in these slides the preliminary scan, the full assessment if warranted, and just keep that in mind. I don't want you to get too far into the SEA side of things, but you need to be aware that when you're dealing with the Government of Canada, there are additional requirements for regulatory approval for something as big as a significant medium to high impact regulatory change will also need to be scanned for potential down-road environmental impacts, or it should be by cabinet directive, all right? So if you're working as a regulator, or even if you're working in industry as a regulatory affairs expert, you will definitely be entitled, if not asked, to comment on, or expected by your boss, certainly to comment on, or your industry association to comment on the RIAS in the Gazette 1 notification. You may also be commenting at some point on an SEA that's being conducted for the regulatory change in areas where we can anticipate after a preliminary scan that the policy program change, or including a regulation, may in fact have significant down-road environmental implications, impact implications, all right? So now it's also important to realize that SEA and EIA are part of the same family, but they're different things. An SEA looks at policy program implications, right? Policy plan or program implications, how those are designed. Will they stimulate negative or positive environmental impacts down the road by the very policy framework or set of rules or set of processes that these things will put in place? All right? What is the impact? An environmental impact assessment, on the other hand, looks at the physical characteristics of an actual project development, like a dam or a major construction project or a major new freeway system or something like that, where there's going to be physical impacts on the environment. The EIA looks at whether, how to mitigate the worst of these environmental impacts. So SEA and EIA are of the same family. They're concerned about decision making with respect to impacts on the environment, but the SEA is early in the design cycle for policy plans and programs to look at, including regulations, to look at what implications, if we design it this way or if we adopt it this way, will that actually cause downroad environmental impacts that we're not, as the proposers here, the proponents here are not anticipating, because they're not environmental experts or whatever the case may be. So you bring an environmental expert and you say, if you're proposing that we're going to develop this regulation to do this, did you think about the fact that this would now become a pattern of activity, and the cumulative environmental impacts of this could be quite severe? So looping back, that the SEA may recommend that we curtail the scope of the regulation, or we make that regulatory requirement unique to a certain set of circumstances, or whatever the case may be, to potentially mitigate in anticipation of those down-road negative environmental impacts. An EIA is a project that's going forward, or is proposed to going forward, and we're looking at the actual physical impacts of an actual physical project, all right, which is a different set of issues. Obviously, a very important consideration as well. Okay, but they are distinct. So SEA's policy plans and programs, how they're designed, what impacts that they could have if we adopt that design for the way we do business in the future. EIA project has been adopted, a $50 billion project has been suggested. How are we going to implement that project in a way that minimizes the negative physical environmental impacts of that project going forward? Okay, so it's important for regulators to understand both, but from a regulatory point of view, SEA, it's important for you to understand, because it's all like a RIAS. It's at the design phases of a new policy, which in this case would be a regulation. All right, so that's why it's important for you folks to understand that aspect. Okay. So it's important to understand that while SEA is concerned with environmental effects of a policy plan or program, including the potential cumulative effects, RIAS is concerned with the potential impacts on health and safety, environment, security, and social economic well-being of Canadians from a more of an economic perspective. All right? So, but both may be required in a case of a regulation that both is a medium to high impact regulation requiring a full RIAS, but it's also a regulation that could have significant down-road environmental impacts, whereas the Europeans might integrate those two things into one study that they call a regulatory impact study. In Canada, we would typically treat the RIAS the way we normally treat the RIAS, but an SEA would also be required. All right? So it's important to understand those things. So we'll talk to you on Wednesday, in our Zoom call on Wednesday. Don't forget you have a quiz to do on Wednesday, which is making up for my faux pas on not having the quiz in week 6 before our break. So we'll do that in week 7. But also on Wednesday's call, we'll discuss the midterm exam for this course, which will be held Thursday and Friday. You will receive the instructions at midnight on Thursday, 12 a.m. Thursday, and responses will have to be in by 11:30 p.m. Friday, just like you did the RGL3000 midterm. That will happen this week, so don't forget that as well. So we'll talk to you all on Wednesday to deal with both questions related to this lecture, and also we'll recap, or we'll talk about what's going to happen in the midterm. All right? Take care for now. Bye-bye.